News.
Bodies of 6 U.S. service members killed in Kuwait last weekend are back on American soil. One of those service members is from the Metro and 2 are from Iowa. Thanks for joining us. I'm Zina Taher. President Trump and Vice President Vance, along with Nebraska and Iowa's governors, were among those who attended today's Dignified transfer at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. The Dignified transfer is a ritual that returns the remains of U.S. service members killed in action. As is protocol, Trump did not speak during this transfer. The 6 soldiers include Sergeant First Class Noah Tegens of Bellevue, Major Jeffrey O'Brien of Waukee, Iowa, and Sergeant Declan Cody of West Des Moines. All of them were Army reservists killed by a drone strike at a command center. Sergeant Tegens was a martial arts instructor in Bellevue. The co-owner of the studio where he taught says he was a hero even in plain clothes.
At one time, he's in the parking lot, and we were training. Next thing I know, we was calling 911 to save a person's life outside, because somebody passed out.
Tegens is remembered as a dedicated husband and father, and we have yet to hear about any public processions or ceremonies planned for Sergeant Tegens, Major O'Brien, or Sergeant Cody.